Philipp and I have a favorite subject we talk about, and that's the World Health Organization. And Philipp is followed by political analyst. I'm so excited to meet her for the first time, Ulrike Guérot. Next on stage, mindfulness and sovereignty advocate, Darren Deojee. Well, she needs no introduction. I'm sure you know her, but both science and natural law expert, Dolores Professor Cahill. And joining us online, I'm sure our technical team is going to admit him into the room right now, is going to be my brother from South Africa. His name is Advocate Sabelo Sibanda, and we call him the people's lawtivist because he believes that law should serve activism for human rights. So we'll just ask our technical team to make sure that Sabelo is available to join us online. The format is going to be each of our wonderful guests is going to present for 10 to 12 minutes. They convey 2 to 3 core messages to you that are inspiring, they're informative, and they're empowering. After which we'll have a brief session for some discussion and some Q&A. So if you have a moment to share this panel, photographs right now, get it onto social media so people know we are here to share that knowledge. We're about decentralizing the law so we can take back our power as human beings. First up, of course, is going to be my wonderful friend, Philipp Kruse.
Thank you, Shabnam. Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. And please, if you could put on the PowerPoint. Yes, thank you very much for organizing this great event, to Maria Hubmer-Mock. So well done. And also thank you to Uwe Altschner to lead the audience through this great program. But most of all, I must thank you to all the experts, the scientific experts that make available their art to the public and make it ultimately available to us, to the lawyers. Yes, so the question is here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you to them. We have heard them right before. So the question is, does the law still serve human rights? Does the law still serve human dignity? And what can we do that this is again the case as it was in the past or as it was intended in the past? I'll give you just a brief overview. I have to run through, and as we have just 10 minutes. I start from Switzerland, being a Swiss lawyer now for 25 years. And my main occupation was tax law. Most of the time as a private independent tax lawyer, but also I was on the other side of the fence in tax authorities for 6 years. Now, since the beginning of 2021, my sole occupation, my main occupation is to restore the fundamental rights and the fundamental constitutional order in Switzerland to the benefit of the people. This is my main purpose, my main business occupation since beginning 2021. We all know that nobody's perfect. The Romans said, errare humanum est. And knowing that, Montesquieu, right before French Revolution, has established a system where he thought it would be capable of having errors prevented, having abuse of power prevented, and he established this very well-known system of the 3 powers, checks and balances. This system actually should allow us to avoid errors. If each of these powers would do their job as it is in Switzerland, very well defined in the Swiss constitution. So I saw it as my duty as a lawyer to activate each of the powers on the Swiss constitution to do their job. And then in another aspect, which is inherent to the epidemiological problems, this is emergency law. This is an emergency action. Under emergency, you never have all the facts at hand. So in order to avoid errors there, you have the principle of a constant reassessment. A constant reassessment of your methods, of your risk analysis, and also of the solutions. So this is what we are heading for, to take on board all the evidence and all the scientific know-how we have heard during the past 20 months. Now, I run through briefly to give you the state in our country, where you will see then it's nothing different probably than what you see in your country as well. With respect to the government, we have the position that PCR is still the gold standard, that experimental mRNA vaccines must still be promoted. Extra powers shall be extended in Switzerland to the benefit of the federal government until June 2024, although the epidemic is over. This is what they propose to the parliament. And most of all, they refuse to do an independent quality control, as one would say in military, and after-action review. This is a situation for the government, for the courts. I've done about, meanwhile, 20 cases, and the courts, they never accepted our demands for proof. As a representative of the victims, I always demanded proof, show us how many people have really been hospitalized as a result of COVID infection, as a clear causal result. How many kids have been hospitalized? Never we received a response from any state agency. Probably the same in Germany, in Austria itself. So the burden of proof was shifted to us, and we were just given empty standard formulas like decisions regarding public health are always done by the competent authorities, and the courts shall therefore not intervene. So we have no progress other than, I must say, in one judgment from the federal Swiss court. They accepted the fact that the PCR test is not suitable to measure a real disease. That was already a little success. But from that, they did not draw the right conclusions. So we are still working on that front. And ultimately, the legislator, who in Switzerland is the highest power to decide and to control even the government, we don't have a constitutional court, because in Switzerland, the legislature is given the highest authority to control all the other authorities. And so some lawyers, together with me, we established a lawyers committee, a Swiss lawyers committee, in order to present to the parliament the facts and the legal conclusions, to show them you are going far, far away from the constitutional basis. And what response did we receive from them? Well, the Swiss parliament does not want to examine the preconditions and justification for emergency law. They even actively promoted emergency logic, and they wrote us back, and this is the third point here, in times of a WHO pandemic, Swiss parliament is not in the position to perform a true independent reassessment. So this gives us a clue where all of this is coming from, where all of these patterns that you have probably observed in your own home countries as well are coming from. WHO. And therefore, coming to the conclusions as Switzerland is concerned, I must say, we don't have a constitutional system of checks and balances anymore with respect to COVID. We have a perpetuation of systematical errors and extra powers, and we have the logic of permanent emergency and fear. So we can say with Shakespeare, Though this be madness, yet there is method in it. There's method in it. What method is there in it? One aspect is the power of business. You might sit too far back, but you see the red part. On the bottom line, you have the timeline going from 1990 to 2020, showing the importance of each business sector. And the red is the pharma sector, starting with at zero, more or less, in the year 2000. These are the export numbers. And it starts with zero in the year 2000, 2001. And in the year 2020, it is by far the most important business sector in Switzerland, the pharma sector. This is one part of the logic. And the other part is WHO. Here, this is a wide topic, but it is important to note that WHO was actually founded in 1948 on the basis of a proper constitution which had all the good and positive aims and purposes in it, that one wonders why they are doing today what they are doing. And we have just taken the first article of their constitution, which is so wonderfully. If we would ask our professor Bhakti, how would you define health? How would you probably define health? And you couldn't define it better than it is in the WHO constitution. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. With this purpose in mind, an organization would possibly never order lockdowns, would never use a system, a PCR system, that would make emergencies as easy as a finger snip, and would never promote mRNA substances, highly risky, highly experimental, where nobody knew in advance what the effects were, but where we know today that they are so harmful. So now my 10 minutes, I guess, are over, although I have 20 more slides, much more to say, and I'm so honored to be here. Thank you very much for having me, and I gladly continue the conversation. Thank you.
The great Swiss lawyer, Philipp Kruse. Thank you very much, Philipp, for your presentation, and of course being mindful of time. I would also want to share that Dr. Uwe Alschner, when he appears somewhere here, it's a sign to our panelists that you have 1 minute left to round up and leave the public here with us today in Vienna, Austria, but also the many people joining us online from around the world with an empowering message. Because the power of the people is greater than people in power. Do you agree? And someone who understands the power of the people very well is Ulrike Guérot. She is a political scientist, and I said to her, I'm so glad to see another woman on the panel who is a political analyst. So with no further ado, warm round of applause for Ulrike Guérot.
I'm very happy to be back in Vienna. I lived in this town 5 years, and I love Austria. I had a wonderful time. So thank you to Maria. Thank you to Maria for having me. Thanks to Uwe also for organizing this. And a greeting to the panel before us, the medical panel with Zönix and Bhakti and all the people who put facts and figures on the table, because I want to chime in precisely on this point and also on the legal problems we have with it. You introduced me saying I know the power of the people. To be honest, I prefer to live in stable political systems. Because when the power of the people is making history, then we call it whatever, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and these moments in life are not funny, yeah? Just make this sure. I'm a political scientist, so this sort of moments where we talk about the power of the people, where the power of the people needs to go against the system, are no trivial moments in time. So I'm basically not so much into the power of the people, I'm much more into stable political democracies where we have legal structures that function, and I want to conquer them back. And to give you just one example, I studied the most recent, I think it happened yesterday, the EMA shifting from temporary to regular acceptance of the vaccines. I guess you read this, yeah? And the most striking sentence in the validation runs like, this recommendation covers all existing and all upcoming adopted Conforminati and Spikevax vaccines. So what does this say? We do have a regulation that covers, beyond any science and beyond any need to prove that this is good, all upcoming vaccinations, all upcoming vaccinations. So what we do here is regulatory or legislative acts that are basically beyond anything like reason, like control, like whatever. We are just saying whatever comes, it's legal. So I think this is a new state of regulatory control. Karin Pistor, who I can recommend to you, is a political scientist of the United States, and she wrote a very good book if you want to deepen this. It's called The Code of Capital. And in the book of Karin basically describes how capital is basically buying justice. And because capital is buying justice, those regulatory things like all upcoming vaccines are the good ones is happening. The thing is that if we want to go against it, because the panel we are in is called Employing the Law to Serve Human Rights, right? I think somebody got it wrong when shaping the panel, because it's not about human rights. We are talking about civic rights. And it's a very big difference, because human rights is the Charter of Geneva, and it's basically that human rights, shelter, food, drink, and basic needs of human men must be guaranteed despite all odds, meaning refugees, war situations, and so. But this is the basics. We are not talking shelter and food and drinks here. What we are talking are functioning political systems, are functioning democratic systems, and are states that guarantee civic rights. And civic rights are more than human rights. It's more than shelter and food and drink and basics, okay? So I think we need to get this very clear. That's about civic rights and our connections to state control, and not that we are basically wanting the basics of human rights. So words do matter. Yeah? Words do matter. If we fight only for human rights, it would mean we have abandoned the idea of functioning political systems. It's very important to say this. Yeah? It's very important to understand this. What we want is elections. We want access to independent justice, right? Yeah, talking to a lawyer here. What we want is balancing of power in our political systems, which is an independent judiciary, which is executive, and which is parliamentary control. What we do not want to see is what we just saw in Germany the other day, the day before, where a government person interfered in the documents of the Bundesrat, basically accepting the Infektionsschutzgesetz, the new German infection law on vaccination. So a government person overnight changed documents of the Bundesrat, which is the second chamber in Germany. This is not what you call balance of power democracy. And we don't change this with the power of the people. We change this with lawyers who go to court. And then we still need to hope that our courts still function, but we need to make the processes about this, yeah? And I think this is very important. So what is happening here? As I argued with the EMA, we are now in a system that wants to push through irrational things. This is what all the panelists of the first panel told us, that the data are showing that this vaccination doesn't help and so on and so forth. You know all the stories. But still the system is trying to push it through. So basically, we are no longer in a system that argues with reason, which is the basic of democracy, but we are in a system that wants to argue with belief. And if you don't believe, then you are oppressed. This is what we are in. We are in a belief system and not in a system about rational, but the ratio, Aufklärung, is the basic of democracy. You can't separate the two. So this is what we need to change. And from there I come to my third point, because if we are in a belief system, and the problem is that if you don't believe, you're oppressed, then the problem is how to change the belief system. How to change the belief system, yeah? And formally, people would know this, that the most important thing is what do you get into the heads and minds of people. The Catholic Church would knew it, the socialists would know it, they had all the schools and the churches, and they would know a century ago that the most important thing that everybody needs who want to establish a system is that you need to feed the heads and minds of people. And you need to have head control, mind control, yeah? Who's doing the mind control today? The mind control today is modern media, modern propaganda, modern advertising, the internet, everything that feeds your head. This is why in my book that perhaps some of you have written about, Wer schweigt, stimmt zu, I wrote the sentence in this book that when we all were getting into this belief system of the COVID, whatever, 19 business, yeah, I listened every evening to Jefferson Airplane, who has a super song, White Rabbit, which is drawn about Alice in Wonderland, and there is this sentence, when logic and proportion are falling sloppy dead, feed your head, feed your head. So I just recommend that you go to the internet, you listen to this song, Jefferson Airplane, White Rabbit, feed your head. So what I want to point to is that we need to cut through the media matrix, because there's obviously much money at stake to feed our heads on COVID, with advertising, with propaganda, and just to say this, also on Ukraine, obviously, yeah? And what is the trigger behind? The trigger is evident. The trigger is money, because you cannot earn something with health, but you can earn a lot with vaccines. And you cannot earn something with peace, but you can earn a lot of money with arms. And so obviously there is propaganda machines that tell you you need vaccines, you need arms, because this is so and that's the narrative and you need to buy it. And we need to break through the media matrix. So here, how do we do this? And this is probably the most difficult thing, because the system has money. We have perhaps the power of the people, but sort of no money. By the way, this is a call for help for Maria, who funded enormously in this conference, and she needs funding for this conference for the fact that you are all sitting here and that there are media people and food around. So that's the problem. The problem is always, where does capital go? So Maria wants capital for this conference, but above this, we want capital for our belief system, which is that what we are in is wrong. And I think the crucial thing is if we cannot make this happen, because if changing the system is no longer possible, as we saw with EMA and so on and so forth, if the system is the problem, and the effort to change it through regulatory legislation things is falling sloppy dead, then what I would like to end with is, what we need is creating a different system. We should stop criticizing, because it's a waste of time. If everybody sees what is happening with EMA, all the data that Zönix and Bhakti put on the table, that all this is there and still the system doesn't react, then basically criticism is a waste of time. This is not saying that we do not need to document. We need to document what is happening. So all this science is very important. But it's a waste of time to criticize with data that the system does not want to see because they're in a different belief system. And if this is so, I think the only and most important thing is we rebuild systems. We rebuild other schools, non-vaccination schools. We rebuild universities. We try to outsource. We try to be creative. We do not let to steal our creative energy. We need to create the alternatives which are more thrilling, more sexy, more beautiful, more healthy, more human than the system is. that's it. So let's invest in thinking the new world, another world, a different world, an alternative world. Everybody at each place where his competence is. And I'm deeply convinced that we can make this so seductive for many people to come and join us, because it won't need a long time to just see that what they are living in, the most mass people, that this is just not going to work. But when they want to let it go, other structures need to be there. So we will need to create the alternative structures as to allow people to basically shift the room. Thank you for your attention.
Dankeschön, Ulrike Guérot. Very informative talk and very interesting ideas to see how legal and political systems work a little differently in our various countries. As I mentioned, I'm from South Africa, and you might have heard of a man by the name of Nelson Mandela. Raise your hands if you've heard of Nelson Mandela. Right, so one of the architects of democracy in our country, and he was, of course, an activist, a lawyer, and the former president of South Africa. And he said, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that enhances and respects the freedom of others." And that to me is the epitome of the power of the people. It's to unite to build a better world together. And in the South African constitutions, I'll wear my lawyer hat for a bit, the rights to free speech and participatory democracy are enshrined as basic human rights. But they only are active and mean something when we use them. So our constitutions are not just pieces of paper to put up on a shelf. And we've realized in the last couple of years that we've got to activate those rights for them to mean something. So I'm very grateful for Maria and for all of the organizers for having arranged this particular panel today as part of the Better Way conference. Our next speaker joining us today as part of panel 2 is, of course, mindfulness and sovereignty advocate Darren Deojee.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I couldn't really ask for a better launch pad than what Ulrike was sharing at the end there. A lot of the people that you see on the stage here today are fresh and active in this fight against tyranny and oppression that we're dealing with, and deceit. I've been in the game quite a while now. I'm not as active as I was. I'm deeply honored to be here and to be invited to be part of these very esteemed individuals. My days of activism were when I blew the whistle at corruption in the Scottish Parliament over 20 years ago, and I got into dealing with trying to speak truth to power, trying to bring humanity and honesty and integrity into the courtroom and into the interactions with public servants, because that was my background, was public service. And I found, as Ulrike was mentioning there, what happens when we find that it's not about the data. What happens when we find out it's about values and beliefs and different ways and different chosen authorities. And so that's where I'm speaking from today. And I realize that a lot of people will not want to hear what I've got to say today, and I'm okay with that, because I'm not here to say no but to anything that anyone here is saying. I'm here to say yes and. Yes and. So a lot of the stuff that I see happening here and what these people are talking about are what I consider to be firefighting. They're firefighting small fires in a wildfire. They're dealing with small waves in a tsunami. You know, little gusts of wind in a hurricane, which to me is what the pathology, the virology, the detail of the shots, the legal issues, and then before all of this, you know, we had other things which people have been aware of to do with chemicalization of food, lack of freedoms of people, you know, just on a daily basis, before we got to this level of tyranny and oppression and invasion of our freedoms. So the solution I'm looking to present today, because I'm here to talk solution, not problem, okay? You all know the problem. There's lots of problem here. I'm here to talk about solution. As one who has tried many of the things these people are talking about, bringing the data, bringing the values, seeking to have a human conversation with other human beings, and discovering after many years of this that it doesn't seem to be about the data. Because if it was, the data's here, and it's not new. If it was about the data, the cascade that we were all seeking and hoping for, surely would have happened by now. This is about authority and people choosing who they value and who they want to associate with. And so I value these people. And I value their authority and their humanity. But that's not what I came to speak about. I don't want to digress into that. I'm going to check my little notes that I've got here to keep me on point, because I'm aware of the limited time here. Yeah, so this is not the first wave of fighters that I've seen, people stirred by injustice and moved with the fire of the fight. And then, you know, this conference is called The Better Way, and sometimes I kind of find myself wanting to reach through to some of these people that I share the platform with. What are you actually fighting for? What is the better way? Is it to win something back? And the thing that you're fighting for, was it ever yours? Do you really want it? Or how much of it is just shock, outrage, horror, and anger at that shock? Because if I wasn't angry, I'd feel helpless and powerless and feel afraid and a bit overwhelmed. It's just a rhetorical question as part of the journey that I've been through and seen many people go through, that fire and fight and anger are often to stop us feeling vulnerable and afraid and stop us turning to each other. Because to me, the better way is about our relationship with each other and how we connect with each other. And this is what you were alluding to there, Ulrike. And for me, the question I've got, and many of these people here, they know this. And my question is, well, where do we have for that better way? All these fights still need to happen. They do need to happen. The comparative data needs to happen. People still need to be shouting the voice out of resistance. It absolutely has to happen. But where are we building the place to have the better way? And that's where I bring my solution to the table to you all today. It's something I've been working on for many years with many people. And it is about the issue of human rights. And as you said, employing the law to bring about human rights, because across the board in the last 20 years of doing this, I have not seen human rights realized where we're talking about security and liberty of the person and the right of self-determination for each of you to choose as freely how you live your life as freely as how you choose your clothes today or your hairstyle. That's what I'm interested in. And I've not seen that anywhere. Not realized in that way. And then I mentioned a little bit at the last Better Way conference about a strategy I'd come across that we could use. And I'm going to re-offer it today for when the fight is over. Where can we be? If we haven't won everybody over to our obviously enlightened way of looking at things, they think the same about us. So one thing has not been realized in any Western nation as yet, and that is a place where security and liberty of the person is realized and the right of self-determination is realized, and it doesn't exist anywhere in the European nations. And it is if we move from under human rights and we sidestep to indigenous rights. And some of you, and the puzzle that got me onto this over many years, I don't do this normally. I run Rites of Passage for Men. I do relationship work with people. I'm a mentor and a counsellor, and I work with boys and men who are struggling with shame and guilt. And this is what gave rise to this for me, was this puzzle of why is it white people in general, or Western educated people, refer to indigenous people without referring to themselves? What does indigenous mean? What does native mean? It's an earthling. It's a human. And which part of our mind has been affected so that we can refer to Indigenous people without referring to ourselves. Refer to natives without thinking that it's you too. So this puzzled me for years, and I was on this for years, talking to many people working with natives all over the world, asking this question. And it was a dear friend of mine, an English woman, answered it, and she said, well, actually, it's because we were colonized so long ago we've forgotten. But you people were not the colonizers. You were colonized. And when I see some of these people speaking here today, they remind me of those old Celtic and Breton tribes facing the war machine of Rome. These beautiful, vibrant individuals, heroic, passionate, attractive, wonderful people facing that ruthless war machine that would just step, grind, step, grind, step. And I've seen many people ground under the war machine of legal process in the last 20 years. And I fear and I'm concerned for that happening to some of these beautiful people, but I can't stop it because that's the cost of resistance and standing up for what we fight, for what we value and seek. So the mechanism that I'm interested in, I'm working on and I'm pursuing, and invite anyone to join with me on that, but I'm going to be doing it anyway. And that is to campaign and fight for native reservations in every European country, which is a place where you have the security and liberty of the person and the right for self-determination. Let me just grab a drink. So, give me a moment. I'll just finish up. So these people on the other side are talking about a great reset. And I know many people who will talk about different law forms, common law, alternative law, and these are all valuable. I've done that, and I am tired of learning languages that are not mine to try to convince somebody that I refute their claim to the highest truth. And that was something I had to heal out of myself, when it was like I was so desperate to convince these people, so desperate for them to see my values, when I was like, well, wait a minute, the way that you are championing and celebrating makes people sick. It makes them dislike themselves. It makes them turn on themselves, addicted, shame, guilty for being a human being. Why am I defending myself to you? Why am I desperate to convince you? I refute your claim. But then all I'm asking for in this is a place where I don't have to enter into all your games of legal jargon, where you're getting paid to be here, but I have to give up my work to turn up. I'm tired of that game. I'm not playing it anymore. That's why I'm not in the active activism scene. I've been sitting as a strategist, watching, advising and consulting all these years, waiting for the right moment. I'm just going to wrap up now. So for me, the Great Reset is, for the real humans, is a remembering of our nativeness, a remembering of the nativity of the white Westerner, and that all this stuff that we're calling alternative is not alternative. It is a return to native. It's not alternative medicine, it's native medicine. It's not alternative gardening, it's native gardening. It's not alternative dance, it's native dance. And you are each healing that bridge within yourselves. So, thank you, I am out of time. I'm going to be passing back to Shadman here. But yes, I will be moving for the Indigenous people of the West to have a place where they can live in a more human way and live that better way, so there is somewhere to go to after the fight. Thank you.
Darren Deojee, isn't he amazing? I'm listening to him speak and I'm thinking about the preface of the American Constitution, we the people. And we have similarities in many constitutions around the world. In South Africa, ours is prefaced on the people shall govern. So any decisions made for us, without us, are, Dolores, unlawful, without our consent and our participation. And we've seen that happen over the last almost 3 years. But we're changing that as we build new systems and as we co-create a better world. And therefore, it gives me great pleasure to introduce someone who's all about new systems, new thinking, but also old wisdom and living the better way. Professor Dolores Cahill. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So it's an absolute great honor as well, and I'm very grateful to be giving a talk in the session on the law. As you might know, my background is in science and immunology. But maybe if you just want to, maybe take a deep breath, because we're going to go on a little journey, if that's okay. And I hope the journey that you're going to go on is of relief. That actually there is a solution, and it's very straightforward. So just to bring you to a beautiful valley in Tipperary, if any was seen, I grew up there as a child. And when I was about 7, 8 years old, Merck Sharp & Dohme, a pharmaceutical company, came into our valley. And the next winter, 17 of our calves died, were either born with 2 heads, some of them with 2 hindquarters. And that brought me on my journey, because really the agents of the state were not solving the problem from when I was about 7 to 21. And one farmer brought a precedence case, and he lost in all of the courts, and he was ridiculed. And as all of us were really, we went from being reasonably well off to having no money, because the milk companies wouldn't buy the milk, even though they didn't recognize the problem. So my grandmother was born in 1886, and my grandfather was born in 1886 and 1884. So my grandfather was involved in 1916, so he was in his 30s, and he stood for election in 1918. And my grandmother was pregnant with my father in 1922 when they came, because he had stood for election and burnt her house when they knew that she was there with a number of children in order to kill them. So when it came to Merck Sharp & Dohme, my grandmother lived with us, and obviously she was an amazing woman, as was my father, and he was involved in farming organizations and setting up a new political party, but also in mediating, because the banks were then pulling in mortgages for the farms, because the farmers couldn't pay their mortgage because everybody was ignoring this huge issue with Merck Sharp & Dohme. So I'm giving you that little background, is that from the very beginning I was interested in justice. So what you want is, if someone is killing calves or poisoning, what you want is justice. And where does justice come from? And this is very simple, and it is the solution, and it's what we're not seeing, is that everyone is accountable for their actions under the law. And so if someone is involved in doing something that's killing people, so under the law, you are guilty for your actions and your omissions. So for example, there was one care home in Ireland with 51 beautiful people. That was their home. And on one Saturday, there was 51 of them. And 2 weeks later, they had been to 19 funerals. And the injection had happened in between. Now, how you solve this issue is, obviously there was one undertaker, the local undertaker, the local coroner, the local policeman, the local pathologist. They are all have the liability under the law to do their job. So if the coroner doesn't do an autopsy because there's obviously a suspicious death, so in this care home there was on average 2 deaths every year, and we had 8 deaths in 48 hours. 19 deaths in 2 weeks, 26 in 5 weeks. So obviously if the law was working, the coroner should have done his or her job, investigated it, and the coroner is guilty under the law for their omission to investigate death, as is the policeman and the undertaker to report that as a suspicious death. So we hear a lot of talk about the law and people making laws. But what people are not taught for 2 or 3 generations, and why I preface it by growing up on a farm in Ireland, is that if you just reflect that societies around the world have functioned beautifully for thousands of years, So there is a book on Brehon law. So Brehon law has existed for tens of thousands of years, and we were known as the land of saints and scholars. There was no prisons and no police force because the law was applied locally. And it's very simple. You cannot go around killing people in any society, whether you're in Africa or in South America or in North America or in Europe. Doesn't matter what society you're in. If there is a death or a suspicious death, the community get together, it's called a jury, and then they investigate it. And what the law is, very simply, is that people have a right to life, and that people have a right in a way to return to their family. That's where this freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of meeting. You can imagine a society functions if a mother has small children. No one can really infringe on your right to travel unless you've been convicted of a crime by a jury of your peers. That's the law. And what people haven't been taught for generations really is that there is a hierarchy of law, so you can imagine it as a tower. And these freedoms and right to life are called inalienable, they can never be taken away, but imprescriptible and not positive law, they are not written down. But they come from you shall not kill, right? And this applies to everyone. So the missing bit is that under the law, which is, we'll say if you have 12 towers, it's at the very top, this natural law, really, you shall not kill, people have a right to life. And then halfway down, the people that are under really the natural law, because even a non-verbal child knows that when they see a wrong, it actually resonates with them, that they know something is wrong. That people then decided only in we'll say a few hundred years to bring in parliaments, and then they wrote pieces of paper, but that's halfway down in the law. So you don't get any of your rights from the Constitution. The Constitution is just one of the pieces of paper that society writes down. And in the law, something higher up cannot be changed by something further down. So say if you have acts or statutes or legislations under the Constitution, you will know you can't pass an act that will change the Constitution. But the really important part is that something is only a law if it doesn't infringe on your inalienable rights to life, freedom of speech, freedom of travel, privacy and private property. So it means that no man or woman, whether they're a president, can bring in any pieces of paper that takes away people's right to life. So you can't say, I'm writing a piece of paper, you can kill every second person. You simply can't. That is what the entire law is. So just because they pass an act doesn't make it law. And there's a word for something, a piece of paper that infringes on your right to life, right of freedom of speech, freedom of travel, privacy, and property. And the word is called malfeasance. So anyone who is paid as a member of parliament anywhere in the world, or a president or a king, that signs or autographs a piece of paper that they knew or they should have known would result in death, or infringes on your right to travel by pretending you can only travel for 10 miles or for 5 kilometers. Who is that a crime for? It is the crime of malfeasance for the members of parliament and the president, because they are committing a crime of infringing on the lawful right of freedom of travel, freedom of speech, private property, and all of these inalienable rights. Now, just to give you quickly examples, you think, well, wait a minute, how does that work? So the law and the legal system are not the same thing. So I'm talking about the hierarchy of law, which is the entire tower, we'll say, of law. So just in a 10-minute video, I managed to stop all of the police checkpoints in Ireland, right? I didn't have to go to court. And there's 3 examples that I'll just quickly give, right? So people think in order to exercise your rights, You have to go to court, but you don't. Under the law, you act in honor and do no harm. So in honor, you have to inform someone that what they're doing is breaking the law, it's unlawful. So in that video, we were organizing the St. Patrick's Day on the 17th of March 2021, and they had put what they called a cordon around Dublin so that no one could travel to celebrate our national holiday, St. Patrick's Day in Dublin. And some of the meetings to organize it were in my house. And then I just did a video a few days before because the police had stopped me and said that for the people in Ireland going to the St. Patrick's Day parade, each of you just take a video and ask the man or woman dressed up as a police their name. Because then I will go to them and say, what you are doing, 12 of you will say as an example, is unlawful, and I will take a case against you for 20 euros for the petrol that family had to, waste by not going to the parade. And why that was important was that whether you're dressed up as a police or a judge or a president, no one is above the law, no matter who you are, and that they are accountable if it is a crime to infringe on people's right to travel. Then the people dressed up as police can also be charged with a crime. But ignorance of the law is no excuse, particularly if you're paid as police. So for a policeman in Ireland to infringe and break the law on your right to travel, it's 20 years in prison. So I was saying to the people of Ireland, just video every single one of them, and then I will randomly take 12, and then I will hold them accountable. And the next day, within hours of the video came out, all the police checkpoints were gone in Ireland, never to appear again. Okay. So why I want to give you a little bit of hope and relax is that, I travel around the world and people say, well, how do you travel? I just say, well, no, I'm not wearing a mask. I do not consent. Because part of your inalienable right to life is bodily integrity, and no one, so this is the law everywhere for people, can force you, they can't bully you, they can't threaten you, they can't force you to wear a mask, they can't force you to have an injection. So the other example, just to convince you, that there was these prison quarantine hotels outside Dublin Airport, but what I did spread around the world. There was a lovely lady who was having mental health issues, and she was considering taking her life, and she put a message out that she wanted to have a phone call with me, which I got within an hour. And I said to her, there was the police and army were around the hotel saying she had to stay in her room for 14 days. So I said to her, do you want to leave on the phone? I was recording it, she was recording it, and she was crying, and she said yes. And this very, it was one of the head of the army in Ireland and said, I said, what's your name? And he wouldn't give it, right? Now that's interesting because they know they're liable, right? So I said that everyone has freedom and you cannot imprison someone in a room anywhere in the world unless they have been convicted of a crime that is an actual crime by a jury of their peers. And she doesn't want to go. So if you don't open the door and let her go, I will call the police, because unlawfully detaining someone that hasn't been convicted of a crime is an offense under the law of 7 years in prison. And of course he opened the door. We did it for 28 people, 28 phone calls over a period of 2 weeks. And so people got it within 90 seconds. And then the last man went back to the hotel and within like an hour knocked on 70 doors and just told everyone you can leave. And that was the end of the quarantine hotels in Ireland, right? So that spread around the world to Canada and Australia and England, right? Because you have an inalienable right. And lastly, I'll just say, I instigated the World PCR Sequencing Consortium as consortium coordinator in 2020. And this is key. Fraud unravels all. And there is no time limit on fraud. So we got ethics approval, but it's important to say we got ethics approval to PCR sequence all future anything that they call a pandemic on anything. So we don't have to go through the ethics process. And in America, we got ethics approval on the 21st of July 21 to DNA sequence all of the PCR testing. And within 24 hours, the CDC and the FDA in America did a class 1 recall of all PCR testing across America, because if the manufacturers or the doctors are giving a false diagnosis based on COVID-19 where there is no DNA, the doctor is liable for all the consequences of the false diagnosis and their private health insurance. But the politicians are all liable in their private and personal capacity, and fraud is a 7-year offense in prison for overseeing fraud. And the people who are liable are the regulators in the CDC and the FDA, right? So just to finish off, when I said come to me on the journey, that just because people say in Austria or Switzerland they passed a law, they didn't pass a law. A piece of paper is only lawful if it does not infringe on your inalienable right of freedom of speech, freedom of travel, and bodily integrity. But if there is one death on a clinical trial, the regulators and the people, the doctor, is liable for keeping on injecting because he knew or he should have known that that would cause harm, and the doctors are liable. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope that was helpful. Maybe one more thing. This is important. No, thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to do it. But you may know that there are 7 court cases, or so-called summonses from the dead in Ireland. One of the main ones is for going to Edinburgh on Friday to give an amazing speech outside the Parliament. No, it was an amazing atmosphere, and I came back on Saturday. So going one day and back another. So of the 7 summonses, the police and the Director of Public Prosecutions are saying that each one of them is a criminal offence, 6 months in prison each. And for the one of Edinburgh and back in September 2020, there is a warrant out for my arrest in Ireland. And 4 of the 7 court cases came up a week ago. So that would have been 2 years in prison, 4 times 6 months each. But what I am doing, so that gives me standing, because they're saying it's because of COVID-19, right? Under the COVID-19 Act, they're saying that you have to restrict yourself to 5 kilometers, unless you volunteer to self-quarantine, which I would never do. But it now means, so 2 weeks ago, just 2 weeks ago though, we had 4 court cases, and the police or the judges didn't turn up in court. So I have 4 months now. Yeah, sure. And I'm just going to, just wanted to say that I'm actually going to launch, I now have standing to find SARS-CoV-2. Because we've been talking about, I think it's the question of a generation, does it exist or not? And so we're going to launch it like the PCR sequencing consortium of the world. So I hope if I do that you'll support me. Thank you.
Dolores Cahill reminding us of 2 words, inalienable rights. And that's not only the responsibility of politicians and the courts, it's ours to defend our rights and to build democracies that work for the 99%. Someone who understands that very well and is as comfortable in a rally speaking to thousands of people as he is in a court defending human rights is advocate Sabelo Sibanda, the people's activist.
Thank you very much, Shabnam. It's an honor, it's a pleasure to be part of this event, because the bottom line is that we are looking for a better way and we are working towards a better way. I love what has been said, and I will ride on a lot of what Dolores just said, because Loctivism is basically about using the law as a tool of activism in the interest of justice for the people. And when we talk about law, we differentiate between the legal system and the law. Coming from an African perspective, more especially contextualizing it to South Africa, apartheid was legal, but it was unlawful. And it is that system that led to us, the people, coming to a position of saying, no, we cannot continue to condone a system that is aiming at our entire alienation and annihilation. And for that reason, you find that we rebel a lot against the system, because the system is structured in a manner that is taking us to our destruction. Hence the reason why, even now within the context of this so-called COVID-19, within the context of these so-called vaccines, we are saying, as the people, our human rights are indeed inalienable, and at the same time, when we talk about human rights, we're not confining ourselves to the definition of human rights because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights chose to categorize them. Our first and foremost human right is the right to personal sovereignty, the right to take a decision which is in keeping with what I consider to be in my best interest, as long as in exercising my best interest, I am not in the process compromising another human being's rights. Every human has that fundamental right as their own right. And this is why, within the context of where we are right now, listening to the pathologists speak, we definitely are in a position to ensure that the law is applied and will be applied. This is why you find that within the context of South Africa right now, we are in a situation where this government is trying to introduce laws which, or rather they're trying to introduce within their legal system regulations which are aimed at ensuring that people lose their right to independence in as far as their freedom of movement. They lose their right in as far as getting medical attention in a manner that speaks to their own choices, and they lose a right as to how to be examined if they need any medical examination. And we are standing up against that. But one of the things that we have learned and are exercising within the context of loctivism, realizing fully what Philipp was talking about when he spoke to the position of the courts. Our courts are compromised. We are aware of the fact that going to court is not necessarily about winning, but it's also about using the system against itself in the advancement of the law, in the advancement of the sovereignty of our people. We have within our constitution, as Shabnam mentioned, one of the core fundamentals of the people shall govern is participatory democracy. So these regulations that I'm talking about that are seeking to introduce three basic conditions. If you are supposedly sick, and where that sickness is defined by government as to what exactly that is, because they just call it a case. If you are suspected of being a case, or if you've been in contact with a case, then you get locked up. You get subjected to whatever it is that the system has designed. And this system calls upon us as the humans of the world who are concerned about our sovereignty, who are concerned about our health, to stand together, because it emanates from the World Health Organization, creating a system that therefore expects everyone to abide by in the name of the law. Because what is happening is that the legal system is actually abusing the law for the perpetuation of unlawfulness. And we are expected to sit back and say, yes, it's fine, because someone who calls themselves a parliamentarian has said that this must be law and it must be called law. Because there is someone who is sitting there as a so-called judge who will go and defend the legal system. The judges that we have in the main now are compromised and are defenders of the system and not the advancers of the law. If they were the advancers of the law, we would not be having this conference today. We would instead be celebrating the fact that the law is being applied for the benefit of the people. The law is being applied in the interests of the people. The law is being applied in the advancement of the interests of the people. And that is the fundamental of how human rights and law interact. And that is the fundamental of how we should revisit what we mean and what we interpret the law to be. And the good thing is, we don't have to create the law. It's been there for centuries on end. What has happened is that the legal system has basically taken a position which has done away with our human rights and given us a facade of what it now wants to contextualize and put in a corner and refer to as our human rights. And here, within the context of Africa, we have the African Sovereignty Coalition. And that coalition is basically addressing anything and everything to do with our sovereignty, where we are clear that what happened in the name of so-called independence from colonization, we just inherited the same old systems, and the people who are now exercising the authority over our lives are using those same systems against us. So it's not about the color of the skin, is not about anything. It's about a system that is imposed upon the people by violating their laws and therefore imposing something that is totally different and alien to humanity. So now we are basically working towards a situation where, thankfully, with the collaboration of the World Council for Health, which has got doctors, scientists, and lawyers, and definitely activists working together, we are now saying, within the context of Africa, we do not consent to having a so-called African CDC circumvent our rights as African people, because they've realized that Africa, being the least vaccinated, so-called, and therefore being the greatest survivor in as far as this man-engineered so-called COVID-19, they cannot get through to us besides going through this African CDC, which they are funding themselves. And they are trying to use so-called international law, which is an international legal system that they have created to try and take away our rights. And we say no. We will not accept that. We will not stand with that. But instead, some of the knowledge that we have received listening to those pathologists this morning gave me a clear view and a clear direction as to some of the things that we need to begin to do to call these people to book. And we have started it. I'm so glad that, in as much as I cannot go into the detail, the meetings that I had, particularly in one of the African countries last week, basically addresses what Dolores is talking about, where the strategy is, let's begin to identify individuals and call them to book. There is a case that we are already structuring and working upon, where it will be our African test case. There is an individual who we have found to be, at least where we are right now, the most vulnerable and therefore our easiest target. And we will attack and ensure that our human rights as Africans are not compromised, and therefore in our victory we are also protecting the human rights of humanity as a whole. Because the situation as it stands right now is such that we who see cannot hope for a better way. We who see, and we who are skilled, and we who have the different degrees and levels of expertise have a responsibility to push ahead with the better way that we're talking about, to push ahead and say, yes, this is what we intend to manifest and this is what we desire, and we will work together towards that which we desire. We will not invest energy in fighting a system. We will not invest energy in trying to right the wrongs of a system that is totally wrong and totally messed up and is working towards our destruction. We will invest our energy in a better way in as far as our health is concerned. What does it help me to have the right to vote, to have the right to go to court, to have the right to have a roof over my head if I am sick and dead? That's not going to help me. The basic right that we need to be advancing right now is the right of humanity to have the health that is informed by nature in the manner that God created everything. Thank you very much. I'm sorry the time is pushing me, but I really appreciate it. Thank you, Shabnam. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you to the entire steering committee for this wonderful work. Thank you very much.
That's why we call him the people's activist, Advocate Sabelo Sibanda. Thank you very much for joining us, brother. Very busy on the African continent. So we have a few brief minutes for a couple of questions and much that our panelists will want to say in response, but they're going to have to keep their responses very concise so that we can round up this session fairly shortly. And perhaps we should, we'll start with Philipp Kruse. And as I mentioned to you, one of our favorite topics Philipp and I engage on is exiting the WHO. You would agree that's what we need to do, right? Because there is a better way. We know that as human beings. So Philipp, some of these strategies we've identified in terms of exiting the WHO relates to accountability. And we have discussed two cases in which the diplomatic immunity of the WHO can actually be pierced by proving commercial activity. How relevant is the subject of conflicts of interest to exiting the WHO?
Thank you, Shabnam. Yes, this is absolutely relevant because WHO was originally created to serve the people's best interest, never to do any harm, and certainly not to serve private business interests. And this is one very fundamental point, to take the WHO by their own rules that still exist, by the way, and if you look them up carefully, you will even find very explicit references that all the basic fundamental rights, Nuremberg Codex, right of self-determination, sovereignty of the people, must be protected while exercising the any kind of health protection. So health protection is not at all above the law and above everything. I was not able to finish my presentation, but this is very key to understand. They should actually observe their own rules. Pacta servanda sunt. They were created for a purpose. They were originally created even for a good purpose. And so, as a lawyer, I'm looking for these sources which give me the possibility to take these guys to court and say, look, you are bound by your own constitution that you have voted on in '48 and which still persists, and so on. So coming back, yeah, this is right. And so if an organization, to make it very short, turns away from the original purpose in the maximum possible way, meaning the organization is not serving the people, but is serving private interests, is not serving the people's health, but it's harming the people, is even killing the people, coming to the conclusion that if this organization is not even anymore willing to pursue its original goals, then it's not only sufficient to step out, this organization must be dissolved and scattered into all winds.
The great Swiss lawyer Philipp Kruse. We're going to move on now to Ulrike Guérot. So Ulrike, the great scientist and philosopher Albert Einstein said, one of the signs of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different result. And that's what we see in our political systems around the world, where representative democracy is not working for the people. And we've seen that most blatantly in the last 2.5 to 3 years. How can political systems be transformed into representative democracy where inalienable human rights, or rights, as Dolores would prefer to say, are paramount?
Thank you for the question. I think I would need a million hours to answer it, because I mean, what is obvious is that we see that the representative parliamentarian systems that we ought to know are basically no longer functioning or dysfunctional. Yeah. So in reaction to this, in political science, we can see a lot about participatory democracy or discursive democracy. For instance, we had a citizen assembly about Europe. Perhaps somebody heard of you. The European Commission invited something like 300,000 people. You could put wishes in the internet. What do you wish for Europe? There were citizens' assemblies, all well moderated and well sort of also searched for by Europe. Yeah, so we try to find new ways of democracy, and there are all kinds of proposals. Like, for instance, you get a parliament which is half elected and half by ballots, to go through the mixture of people, to cut through the meritocratic elements, because what we see in research is that we all talk about gender and diversity in parliaments, not enough women and so, but the real underrepresented people is obviously the non-educated and the poor, right? So we never talk about them. If you talk about gender equality in parliaments, normally you take a man out of the parliament who is a lawyer and you put a woman who is a lawyer, but they are on the social strata anyway up. Yeah? So the underrepresentation of parliaments is not about diversity and women. It's also there, but it's not. It's essentially about the social sort of strata. So you can change this with all the formula we try to find, like discursive participation, ballots, blah. The thing is, and then there's interesting research, if you do, for instance, citizens' assemblies, those who come are the same who are in parliaments, yeah? Because the others feel like I'm not dressed up, you know, or I can't speak, or I'm too timid to speak openly. So the real problem is how you get those underrepresented people, even if you offer participatory representative structures, yeah? So all this to say, I need to be very short because I need to leave at 1 p.m., but we haven't found the way. I think we are in a huge transformation of democracy and what it is. It seems like we are trying to find the notion of sovereignty again. Who is sovereign? What is sovereignty? Yeah, it's not so easy to answer. Yeah, so there's a huge discussion about what this is, because Hannah Arendt once said, if man wants to be free, it's precisely sovereignty that he needs to let go, because nobody is free, can live alone. Yeah, so it's important questions, but here's my point. We are going through this transformation of democracy. We are having digital forms, new media, the whole thing. We are changing what the Marxists would call the Unterbau. Yeah, so we need to get a different Überbau. The Marxists were always saying the Unterbau, so the socio-economic structures define the state structures, right? So if we now change the socio-economic structures, because we are going from industry society to service society to algorithm society, we are changing the socio-economic structures of society. So by definition, we will need to have different forms of democracy overarching these new structures, yeah? But where I am not so much at least not enthusiastic about, is I'm all in favor of what has been said by the last speaker and by the lawyer here, which is we need to get the system back on track, because the system has it all in itself. We have super constitutions on the European continent. We have a super UN Charter. We have a super Charter of WHO. We have good texts of law, and we should restore them. Yeah, and restore them with the own, wie sagt man, Anspruch an sich selbst, with the own sort of the standards that we are going to, that these texts have, yeah? And what I see in the trend of the time is that we have all this sort of civil war, protests, blah, 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 against the system. But I'm just saying, and I said it, if you go there, normally it's not trivial in history, yeah? So this protest change the system sort of thing, most of the time leads to animal farm. So, or at least there's some historical evidence. So I would just much more pledge for restoring the system, and as you have been saying, go to WHO and say, look, that's what you wanted, is protect citizens' health and not to destroy it. This is what we need to pledge, I think.
Yes, of course. Dankeschön, Ulrike Guérot.
Yeah, obviously, for this we need the pressure of the people, yeah? But to be honest, I mean, yeah, sure, but the problem is, I mean, then we have different questions and we probably can't answer them, yeah? The pressure of the street, the pressure of lawyers who pressure the legal system, everybody who pressures where he is, the teachers who pressure in school, their school director, and so on and so forth. I don't think that one demonstration is changing the world, but I would argue that if everybody pressures its institution where he is in, then I guess you can change, yeah? And then the protest cannot be delegitimized, because that's the problem we have. The protest today is delegitimized. Speaking here is delegitimizing me to a certain extent, right? Speaking on a demonstration is delegitimizing me, yeah? But so how can we basically go over this problem that the delegitimizing of the protest is part of the system, yeah? And if then we think about pressure and where we mobilize the pressure, and if capital, as I tried to explain, is the problem, perhaps we should pressure capital, yeah? I mean, I think there are different forms to think about here, but I think we can't solve the question. It's an enormous question because everybody is sensing that there's a huge disruption, system disruption going on, yeah? And we are all in that. It's like Stefan Zweig, das Problem der Zeitgenossenschaft ist nicht zu sehen, in welcher historischen Entwicklung sie sich befindete.
Dankeschön. So certainly we do need multi-pronged approaches, and it takes all of our participation to build the better world that we need, we want, and we deserve. Darren Deojee, our problem is not civil disobedience. Our problem is civil obedience to injustice and unlawfulness. How do we inculcate in young people the principle, the philosophy, and the approach of sovereignty, young people?
It's a very good question, because usually the young would be the most rebellious, and yet in recent times I've seen the young to be the most statist. And it's a big issue that I'm dealing with the young back in the UK, or trying to. I like the last speaker had some great things to say there, where I don't have an answer. I'm just in the thick of the human problem of, you know, the state being presented as a caring authority, where you just have to be around it long enough to find out that's not the case. But for a lot of these young, they haven't found that. So for me, it's really about that, connecting the young with their own sense of values for processing the world, rather than accepting the values they've been presented with. It's a very tricky one. And I think until we have more impact from the work of activists and loctivists, and I mean, I love what Sabelo was saying, until there's more efficacy from there, it's difficult for the young to see that it's worth questioning and challenging authority, because they're not seeing valuable outcomes from it. You know, and for me, one of the big strategies that we haven't addressed in some of this is, why is it the judges are not going along with incredibly well-constructed cases that show basic human values are not being respected by the systems that we've created to uphold them? And it's something that we've also was speaking to the table about with you the other day about it, where you know, until we can make the judge a hero for going with us, a bit like what the mafia used to do, that we can't do with money anymore. But if you put yourself in that judge's shoes, if you're there, it doesn't matter the merit of your case, if that judge doesn't think they're going to be a legend and a hero for going with you, what are you really asking of them? And for me, I think the young need to see that kind of human engagement in the older generations, where rather than trying to beat each other with sticks into doing things, or shaming and blaming and goading in different ways, if they can see that our victory is with mutual success, that it is win-win, it's mutual upliftment and mutual good results and good rewards, then they're going to think we've got something worth saying. You know, until then, though, because of the delegitimizing that Ulrike was talking about, the young are just getting this social narrative just being bombarded at them. They're on their screens more than any of us are, and we're probably all on our screens too much. You know, they're just being bombarded by that. Until we get something that shows that this human narrative we're bringing has value and goodness in it, you know, I'm just in the mystery scratching my head with the I don't know. Sorry.
A good answer from Darren Deojee. There's nothing wrong with saying we don't know, but we are figuring it out together as part of the better way for a better world. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so my apologies, and I feel I would be dishonoring both Dolores and Sabelo to ask them to answer a question in 60 seconds each.
Can I just say something really quickly?
Yes.
So maybe just to say there are solutions, right? And just if you want to look at your credit card and see your all caps name, and on your passport 2 names in capital letters, that is actually a fraud. It's a misrepresentation, and fraud unravels all. So the very simple thing is just that these civil servants and the UN and the WHO, no one is above the law in each of our nations. And in the World Freedom Alliance, we sent out notices for liability to every head of state, every United Nations, the World Health Organization a year and a half ago. Notice to principal is notice to agent. So they are liable. There's no immunity. And if they kept on like one regulator, the clinical trials when people died, the civil servants in the departments of health are liable. So just in Ireland, we are re-upholding the law. So part of it is I've set up this World Audit Office, is to assess if the men and women who are on the Supreme Court in our nations are preventing harm and death, which is their job. It's quite easy. There's only 12 of them, and there's only one head of state. And if you audit the law, and they are not upholding the law and standing by, then they are liable, but to the families of the parents, right? So that father who was told, this is safe and effective, or coerced into doing it in order to get an operation, then they are liable. So one of the really interesting things is, and part of my case, is I've been asking the judge to produce the so-called warrant, right? And is it autographed? Because the newspapers have written about it, and I've never seen it. But the reason is, now the judges have to know the law. If they put their name to it, they're committing a crime publicly of 20 years in prison for the judges, because it isn't a crime. And so that one case, like the Willem Engel case, will mean that the judges are liable. And why this thing has gone on for all these years is that the judges are not taking the coroners in or the police in and saying 8 people died in this house in 48 hours. What happened, right? So you can simply, once the civil servants are liable, if they say, I am approving a clinical trial, the regulator holds all the liability criminally and professionally, then this will end the whole thing. And we're doing it in Ireland. So we're just asking, is the 1924 Court Act, is it signed, right? That sets up the courts, that appoints the Supreme Court. And it turns out it isn't, right? So that is the case in Canada and in Australia. That the people, but the law is done by juries in your local area, and you have a convener in the law. So that is the solution. It's about holding one coroner, one judge liable, one police, and that's why the checkpoints in Ireland disappeared. because they know the law, and the police know if they are misrepresenting the law, they hold all the liability criminally, professionally, and their indemnity insurance. So there is a solution, and we are doing it in Ireland. We're working with 4 nations, and we're also reasserting the nation and recognized under international law. So, you know, you just need to know that there are solutions, and it's not that difficult, and we are doing it.
Thank you very much, Dolores Cahill. And if you want to hear from Advocate Sabelo Sibanda, get into touch with either of us and we'll tell you more what's happening in South Africa. Thank you very much, Sabelo. We've got Dr. Paul Alexander waiting online for us. You know Dr. Paul Alexander, I'm sure. We're going to have a quick lunch now, so thank you very much for being part of this panel. And in the words of Arundhati Roy, a new world is possible. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. There is a better way. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So right now we are going to have the lunch break, and we ask everybody to please join back in at 1:45. So we are starting at 1:45 here again, and also the interpreters who are doing the translations online, they need a break. And please a big applause for the interpreters who are doing the interpretations, German, English.